coming for our panel. We're going to be addressing basically the national security components of Armenia and capacity building within that context. My co-panelists today, to my right is Dr. Ohanyan. She doesn't need much introduction. She's the Richard Finnegan Professor of Political Science at Stonehill College. Probably has written more on the region in Armenia than anyone in the world, I would say. Specifically, that's true, that's true. And I guess I show specific deference to Anna for her work on regional fracture and introducing important understandings of how we can conceptualize the region. But we'll be touching up on that as well. And then to my far right is Jim LeMay. He is a pretty well-known figure in the media and journalism world. Jim was for over 10 years the deputy managing editor at CNN, and he also ran the CNN newsroom. Right now, he does extensive consulting work, specifically with the U.S. State Department. So he's here in that capacity as having prolific experience both in journalism and understanding various regional developments, specifically within the context of security. So I'm going to begin the panel of discussion on sort of quickly touching up what defines the current security climate in Armenia and in the region. We all understand that the growing security dilemma that Armenia has faced since 2020 and the continuous complexities that we see in the region are intertwined with both regional developments and international developments. And so understanding the sort of the nuanced nature of our region, Armenia's security does not exist in a vacuum. Armenia's security is an extension of the security of its neighbors, the structural factors that shape the region, and then the given international powers that are now playing a bigger role in the region. In that context, when we talk about Armenia's security, we're talking about a new South Caucasus, and we use the term geopolitical pluralism. Whereas in the past, the South Caucasus was singularly dominated by Russian hegemony, that no longer is the case. We have competition in the region from the Europeans, we have competition in the region from the Americans, and of course, the continuing Russian presence. Turkey is always an actor in the region, as is Iran. So we see that there's quite a bit of pluralism with respect to competition for interests, posturing, and addressing both the complexities of the region's security and the interests of the given actors involved. So within the confluence of these sort of multi-layered, complex developments we're observing, you have Armenia, a nascent democracy that is threatened by its much stronger, militarily stronger authoritarian neighbor, Azerbaijan, and a northern neighbor in Russia who has basically abdicated all of its security responsibilities towards this nascent democracy. So in the confluence of this development, we're going to be talking about what Armenia's new security architecture is supposed to look like. How does a small state survive when surrounded in such a neighborhood? And then we're going to apply this of the broader structural understanding at the geopolitical, regional, and international level. Those who were here for the book talk we had earlier, we addressed some of the sort of the internal developments that are shaping Armenia's security thinking. So we see that Armenia has transitioned from a Russo-Soviet model of security to a more small state comprehensive security model, very much based on Finland, Sweden, and the Baltics. And so we're talking about a small democracy that strengthens institutions, develops the capacities of its security architecture, and becomes a regional actor, therefore mitigating its security shortcomings. While it's a work in progress, that appears to be the vision. In the confluence of all that, we talk about things such as resiliency, the role of civil society, the role of the private sector, and the role of the institutions of government working together to comprehensively and collectively enhance the security situation of the country. And of course, at the same time, we are talking about also hard power capabilities, right? With democratization has come economic growth, and with economic growth has come a capacity of Armenia to pivot west, and through this pivot have access to Western arms markets. And so Armenia right now, to meet the severe asymmetry in power with respect to Azerbaijan, is purchasing more weapons than it has ever done in the past. And so this is also the hard power component of enhancing your security capabilities. So tying all of these together and understanding sort of the broader framework that we find ourselves in, I want to begin a conversation by opening it up to Anna to kind of draw a connection between, Azerbaijan's and Armenia's understanding of regional security. And you've done a lot of work on the role of peripheral states in imperial structures and the growing or diminishing role of Russia and how Russia affects the Armenia and Azerbaijan conflict.
Thank you very much for the question, Nerses. Indeed, my approach, my take on Armenia is very much at the regional level of analysis, which I do find it useful in understanding and explaining the domestic politics as well as foreign policy, as they tend to be intertwined. In respect to the specific neighborhood that Armenia is in within Russia's periphery, I do think that this is a period of a neo-imperial emergence, but also neo-imperial decline at the same time. And when I do use the concept of imperialism, I'm using it really as a form of political organization. So it's not meant to be normative judgment. I'm not arguing whether normative or alternative or nation state is better for security, et cetera, et cetera. So that's not what I'm doing. To simplify, Russia's attempt, and it's not just Russia, Eurasia is a very much a neo-imperial continent. Russia, Turkey, China, Iran. There's very good research on this. I have been writing about this, but also Jeff Mankoff has a very good book on Eurasia's empires. And states that practice this specific type of geopolitics, imperial geopolitics, it really rests on not recognizing borders. Rules are fuzzy. So with this approach to practicing geopolitics, this creates serious risks for small states like Armenia, Georgia, as well as Azerbaijan. But that's a different subject for all kinds of reasons. Small states like predictability. Small states like rules, small states like rules-based world order. So while this is a period of new imperial decline that Russia is in that process, that creates opportunities for small states. And why is it in a process of Russia's attempt to practice this new imperial politics while also really losing, I would argue, a lot of levers over the continent is that with the Russian invasion on Ukraine, this is a historically unprecedented moment that Russia lost its centrality, geographic centrality, geopolitical centrality over connectivity over the Eurasian continent. This is of historic proportion, and I'm not saying that Russia is going to weaken. That is definitely, I still do think that Russia-Armenia relationships are very important, that Armenia does need to stabilize its relationships with Russia, but at the same time, understanding that shifts in relationships are happening. Shifts in relationships are happening. I do see this as a process for Armenia to emerge as a small state and start practicing strategies in foreign policy as a small state. Up to this point, when Armenia was trying to build its statehood within Russia's peripheries, it did have all kinds of risks in slowing down its state-building processes. So in this respect, Armenia is emerging as a small state, and it has to practice those strategies. Few points as to implications on state building for Armenia. And here I would like to introduce, I don't think we talk enough about agency. That Armenia, while everything looks negative, existential, Armenia does have agency. Armenia's society has agency. And in this respect, understanding where and how Armenia practices it is really critical. During Nerses' book panel, we're talking about, there are all kinds of several questions on democracy versus security. Well, Armenia experienced democracy. How come? It's not getting the sort of the hard security that it probably should have. Two questions, I think when we do think about, and I do get this question a lot as well, democracy and security. Armenia's democracy, I'm really, really happy that it has not been geopoliticized. When Armenian Velvet Revolution unfolded largely through the bottom up, people played an important role, and as such, they were able to shield its democratic transition, breakthrough from geopolitical influences. And in this respect, it allowed Armenia to continue with geopoliticizing it would have been very costly, because as you see in the case of, unfortunately, in Georgia, which I would argue has geopoliticized its democratic transition, the same for Ukraine, that polarizes society, strengthens the executives, there are institutional costs to it. So that's number one. Number two, security democracy link is important in terms of understanding domestic and foreign relations, by the way. The longer societies stay democratic, the deeper, the quicker they're more durable, their security dividends emerge from democracy. The longer Armenia stays on the democratic trajectory, its institutions will strengthen, court system builds up, police sector strengthens institutionally, and all of conflicts, protest activity, domestic issues become handled institutionally. I'm not saying I'm dreaming of a world when there are no protests, absolutely not. But there's a very direct link between deepening democracy and strengthening security domestically. Moreover, okay, actually let me not do that footnote, and internationally, when you start talking about democracy and foreign relations, that's a much more complicated conversations, because on the one hand, Armenia coordinating, cooperating with similar democratic societies and small states is important, but at the same time, small states, regardless, democratic, authoritarian, they benefit from geopolitical stability. There are certain conditions. They benefit from predictability. And I would not say that it's only democratic great powers are the ones that are able to provide such conditions. Authoritarian big great powers also have incentives for stability. So in this respect, Armenia has a role to play. Armenia as a small state can be compared to Finland, Estonia, but they're in a very different regional environment. And I do think we think about what does a small state strategy look like when it is not in a democratic neighborhood. And this is where, and I'll conclude here, Armenia's deep coordination with Georgia is really important and crucial, because regional level variables are crucial for democratic consolidation and small state strategy. I don't want to speak about Azerbaijan for a variety of reasons, simply because some of the small state strategies also apply for Azerbaijan. The challenge in Azerbaijan is that it's a petro-personalized, militarized petro-state, where the social contract with its people with declining oil reserves is eroding. It's not sustainable. While it is in the interest for Azerbaijani people, Azerbaijani states to behave in a certain way, what you see happening is very much captured by the Aliyev regime. Aliyev family, I should say. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Anna. And so, important points here that I kind of want to tie in and then ask James my next question. So, when we talk about capacity building, the important component of understanding capacity building is, do you have the institutional capacity thing, structuration, and the ability to do it? And the biggest problem that Armenia faces that because for the last 30 years, ever since independence, Armenia's overall security architecture was known as extended deterrence, which was fundamentally based on Russia. And so the logic was that if you need to deter an enemy, you extend that by basically having someone else do that for you. And so what happened is that instead of Armenia developing the capacity to have deterrence and a robust security architecture, both from the institutional level to the societal level and the cultural level, we had basically farmed out our understanding of society through the notion of extended deterrence. And this has produced few developments, whereas Azerbaijan has exercised an independent foreign and security policy, Armenia did not. Therefore, there's been a disparity between Azerbaijan's ability to progress, while Armenia remained dependent on an allied, quote-unquote, allied partner. In the confluence of that, Georgia's situation has also been a little distinct. While Georgia was able to basically decouple itself with the Rose Revolution from Russia, it produced another form of dependency on Western and European funding, and thus limited its ability to also enhance its security architecture. In the confluence of these developments, I want to bring dreams into the discussion. You obviously have an extensive experience in sort of the post-Soviet space, and in a perspective, I would like your opinion on what you observe to be the capacity limitations or the structural limitations that Armenia is going through, and what you have observed in other parts of the world where small states similar to Armenia have had these kind of problems, and have they proceeded to at least try to mitigate these problems?
Well, thank you very much. I would tell you that I've been fortunate to be able to witness or be eyewitness or on the ground many times when you've seen conflict overtake a particular area. Think of Syria, Afghanistan, etc. Very vibrant communities at one given time, but because of conflicts, they had no reason to try and control it. They were overwhelmed. And they were not prepared in any way in order to sort of figure out what next steps were. Some of them were left demolished. We're seeing that in Ukraine, of course, where it just feels like scorched earth, level the ground. And then if you think about that, you have to rebuild from ground zero. That's an extraordinary position that you never want to put yourself in. And I'm not saying that's where you're going. I'm saying that's sort of the modern attempt to sort of overwhelm you to the point to where you're left with very little and you have to depend on many other organizations and people and states to rebuild. But let me tell you the one thing I worry about when it comes to security and democracy. Democracy cannot thrive without people being eyewitnesses, without that fourth estate called journalists that hold accountable and can document how things progress and don't progress. It's vital for you to be able to have a vibrant journalistic community to make that occur. And it's not just the features, it's holding governments accountable. It's making sure that we make everybody who understands what their role is and what is not true and what is true. The other attack you're under right now, and you don't even know it sometimes because it's become so sophisticated, is disinformation through cyber warfare. When I say that, it's like social media is the logical platform. We talked about it a lot recently with many of the AUA students, et cetera, but you don't know it's there until it's probably already had its influence. And you don't, if you're not aware of it, and it was overwhelming in the US during the 2016 election, just to give you an example, and other examples like vaccines and all the controversy about whether I should get a vaccine, they seem very innocuous until they become very successful, and they don't have to raise a gun at all to be able to influence the policies they want you to do. And in fact, through this disinformation campaigns, they can put one against the other, and they do all the work for them. They'll destroy each other. So be aware that is the new combat arm, for lack of another term, that allows Russia, China, North Korea, other bad states to have influence without having invasion, physical invasion. I'm going to be clear about that. So I want to not scare you into this, but I want to make you aware of it. It's like one of many things we've been working on, both as myself as a consultant and CNN prior to, was how to combat it, how to recognize it, and how to inform people what it is and what it's doing, and what this misinformation, whether it's false or otherwise, its influence and its power against trying to create what is, I would essentially say, a good democracy. So we're now in a different world where for many years, and they've been a terrific job of recording this, it has been alignments with countries. It has been how do we better arm ourselves, and those things are still important. But this new threat is like out of thin air, and it's very sophisticated. And I'm not just talking about fake news or having an AI anchor. I'm talking about stuff that's very subtle, that appears to be very benign, but works and augurs its way in to the society. And before long, I start to believe it. And if I believe it, I will take action against anybody they choose to put me toward them. And before you know it, you've eroded every effort you've tried to create a democracy. The vanguards of that are the people themselves that need to know what it is and how to combat it. The people that are the stewards of that are your journalists. They're the ones who can be the vanguards, the witnesses, the people that can help you better understand as a society where it comes from, how to combat it. Because if you don't nationalistically work together, this all falls apart pretty fast, right? You can have great institutions, you can have a powerful military, but if nobody really understands their role individually, shopkeepers, you said earlier, cab drivers, this all falls apart pretty fast. There's several things going on at the same time. You have to develop the institutions, you have to have a democracy that's strong, but you have to have people who are nationalistically invested and protected to the degree they're informed and empowered with information by a very important fourth estate.
Could I piggyback on that? That's such an important point, James. I just wanted to add that there's now very exciting scholarship on why is illiberalism thriving. There's a very pretty extensive illiberal coordination within the Eurasian continent, but even beyond Europe. Some of the challenges for democracy and pure security is the rise of post-truth, which is connected to opportunities of hybrid warfare that Jim explained and Nerses has been writing about. So post-truth is a huge factor, also polarization. On the one hand, we do want a pluralistic society in Armenia. I want to debate and disagree in my family, with my friends, which I always do. But at the same time, unless there is a consensus that democracy is the superior, best tested model for Armenian statehood, Armenian agency, Armenian survival, then Armenia indeed will be endangered. So polarization is definitely a huge factor, a problem that I think we do need to keep in mind. Armenia has been lucky, perhaps, in sort of avoiding the type of deep fractures that existed within Georgia as well as Ukraine. Even though the society to you might seem polarized, if you look at the opinion surveys, it actually is not deeply polarized. So unless the existing cleavages are managed, next thing you know, the rise of so-called, and I'm using someone else's concept, I'm forgetting, cannot remember the author's name, he uses the concept of anti-politics, meaning when people do not trust the institutions anymore. As polarization deepens, they do not look at institutions to solve problems and conflicts, and everything that they start looking for solutions outside, and not necessarily let's bring down this government that is to the left and bring this government that is to the right. That no, the argument then becomes the system does not work. It's that anti-establishment, but very much anti-institutional, anti-politics. And that for Armenia, I firmly believe Armenia historically has been an institutionalist nation. It has always self-organized, even after the genocide. I think it's a painful chapter in Armenia's history, but it also a really interesting period to understand how Armenians came together, the types of civic connectivity that emerged between civic groups and political parties in Transcaucasia or in the Ottoman Empire. I'll stop here simply to add that polarization is a huge risk, and unless managed, it's shown to lead to democratic declines. There are quantitative studies on this. Armenia does not have to follow that trend.
Thank you, Anna. That actually is going to lead up to my next question. When we talk about security, we always are stuck on the hard power components, generally speaking. Military reforms, arms procurement, et cetera, et cetera. And we could talk about those for hours, but I want to kind of engage in this more of a distinct and a complex understanding of security. And that is the role of social forces, civic society, media, that actually inform and help strengthen security aside from the hard power dynamics. And one of the most important things that we're seeing, as Anna noted on polarization, is resiliency studies demonstrate that you must have an inclusive political system and a functional pluralist electoral system to actually develop a healthy democratic structure that can have security. And what we have seen, and Georgia is going through this, and potentially Armenia can struggle with this, is that when you have an illiberal opposition, or what Anna have used the term authoritarian vestiges. When you have an opposition that fills the vacuum, right, of the position of an opposition that is non-democratic or anti-velvet, what that does is not only does it limit the ability of pluralism to basically develop in a political system, but it leads to the only democratic party that is the government in power to consistently be elected. The concern with that is, while the will of the people is expressed, it does not allow for any alterations or shifts in power and policy, and therefore creates potential concerns about the robustness of democracy. And since democracy and security go hand in hand, electoral pluralism is crucial. And to do that, Armenia must develop organically, intrinsically, a democratic opposition. And this has been one of the biggest concerns that we've had, in that, of course, we're a vibrant and growing democracy, but the sustainability of it requires also a vibrant and democratic opposition. And so in the confluence of that, the question comes with respect to the role of civil society. Anna and I have written about this, the whole bottom-up approach in bringing about political change, structural change, democratic change. So in that context, I want you to kind of chime in on this, Anna. What role can Armenia's civil society play in strengthening, enhancing, encouraging, and providing the platform for an alternative democratic option in the electoral field, right? That's designed to both complement the velvet, but also strengthen the velvet, which is going to strengthen Armenia's democracy.
Thanks for the question. Indeed, I have learned so much from the civic actors in Armenia. Actually, Sarah, back in 2016, largely inspired but by the several civic organizations, NGOs, people, the work that Maria does, and I don't want to start naming names because there's so many, that I built a program from Stonehill College to bring my students to study how Armenia's civic space works. And I have actually a student here, I want to shout out Audrey Sears, although she's not here, part of my program, Gayana Ivajan is with her. So it's a different program. I think the Armenian project is that. So I just want to highlight that Armenia has so much to offer in terms of the way civic society has worked before the velvet as well as after the velvet. And sometimes I think once you're in a country, you don't see it. So in terms of the role of the civic society, obviously, every political science textbook will highlight where all the democracy ranking agencies will have a huge discussion on the importance in civic society. So I don't want to highlight and sort of reiterate those points. But what is really exciting and important for Armenian civic society to start developing political alternatives for ideas within the democratic consensus, I think obviously the media plays an important role. But at the same time, I think the heightened security environment I would argue, has prevented for this alternative political discourse to also emerge. So that really has been dominant. And having said that, there is some countries, I think we really have to start studying Armenia as I'm not minimizing all kinds of problems Armenian democracy has, so absolutely not. But I think the fact that Armenian democracy survived a very serious security attack, whether in Nagorno-Karabakh, even though that was not in Armenia's territory, but there's huge political crisis. The fact that Armenians managed their political crisis through the ballot box, was a very huge win. So there's a really interesting book that I'm schlepping and carrying out with me called Democracy in Hard Places. So countries like India, Indonesia, Argentina, these are countries that have all kinds of structural factors, high level of poverty, unemployment, fragmentation, polarization, ethnic diversity, that you would think would make it difficult for them to keep the democracy. Democratic theory looking at these countries will say democracy should not have survived in India or in Argentina, for example. But they did. Now the scholars are very carefully, and these are very initial steps, are asking, should we be trying to understand what are the sources of resilience and durability? How does democracy survive in such places? So at least in one study, this is a very new field of study, the finding is that these democracies survive because, and this is fascinating to learn, not because of an individual leader, which Armenians are really always are looking for the success, like the Sasunsi David or the Superman or Superwoman will come and save. No, the democracies survive because there are collective identity of groups that have normative commitments to democracy. That is just fascinating to me. Meaning, what is a collective group? That could be a collective group that is in charge, political party, could be the executive, could be the civic groups, but essentially there's a collectivity that exercises some political power that is committed to it, to democracy. And again, going back to civic society, Armenia's agency actually comes from its civic society. Historically, in Soviet period, it's obviously, I lived in Soviet Union, but I have not studied Soviet Union, so I'm not very well versed to speak about the very little civil society that existed within Soviet Union, but looking at connectivity and civic fabric of Armenia and Georgia in Transcaucasia, and now these are fascinating. To survive as minorities in imperial systems, Armenian communities have always been connected. They have disagreed, there were a variety of political parties, but you always had collectivities. There were women's groups that were there. So moving forward, I would argue that the I would hope that the civil society would become the vehicle for alternative ideas pertaining to Armenia's trajectory would emerge within the democratic consensus. But yeah, I think the vestige powers, and that is every democracy, this is a nascent democracy, it's a very young democracy. Every democracy has to new democracy has to manage the problem of old elites. That's natural, that's expected, that's nothing to. Moreover, studies also show that about 3/4 of the previous political parties, before the authoritarian parties, come back to the political system. Some of them as new parties or old parties, but some of them play by the rules, which is good. But because we are in a very new imperial continent, that's much harder to achieve that result because there are all kinds of meddlers, right? So the risks are a little bit higher for the older parties not to play by the rules. I'll stop here, but yeah, civic society is hugely important.
Excellent. James, I want to ask a question that's actually a bit of a sensitive one, but very important for us to understand. And this is sort of the conflict between transparency, journalism, and political culture. And this is very important to national security, developing security, and also capacity building. In Armenia, security has always been a very sensitive issue. And journalists have had to engage in self-censorship. An example would be, conceptually, our armed forces. For example, journalists might have knowledge of limitations in the armed forces, but you cannot publish about that because culturally it's sensitive, and also it creates serious issues where the journalists would engage in self-censorship. Yet, if that was exposed and written about, it would have made society healthy. Right. So what happens is that societies that struggle from severe security dilemmas tend to exist in a bubble. So, for example, for 25 years, Armenian society was being told that we had the most powerful military in the region. And to question that objectively, empirically by a journalist would have been considered to be incomprehensible. And so journalists had to engage in self-censorship due to cultural sensitivity issues. Now, in a growing democracy, while those sort of rigid structures have fractured, they still exist. I want to, from your level of expertise, I want to understand how can the media, how can journalists maintain a balance between sort of being cognizant of those cultural sensitivities, but also serving the public in transparency and exposing things that are actually important to the national security structure?
Well, all that's about to change, just so you know. And here's why. We're going through a generational change that has been in the works for some time, but is now going full effect. I'm talking about millennials and Gen Zs, which are taking over by sheer numbers around the world, just by bulk. And we've done a lot of research on these two generational groups. And I would tell you, they are quickly making changes in terms of political views, societal expectations, that is, their parents would go, I can't believe they're doing that. So those of you that are boomers, don't feel bad, but at the end of the day, you're being overwhelmed by this group. And they are very socialistic in their approach. And what you just was they're transparent. They're hugely, hugely engaged in transparency. And here's where it gets interesting. So take China, North Korea, and other countries, and those are the most obvious, that try and limit information. They basically ban things, they censor things. That's the most extreme. It never works. It never works. Especially in the society of technology, the revolution we're going through, people find a way, right? Remember, everybody's got a device. That group grew up with this device in their hand, which is both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is they can find out a lot of things. The curse is it's not always right. But it also allows them to organize instantly. Numerous examples, I won't bore you with. The one I'll start with is when there was horrible school shootings in the US, and students decided, it's enough. They organized very quickly, within days, had 10,000 people marching. That's extraordinary. And my generation would have been like, all right, let's make some calls, we'll see what we can get, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just one example of the influence this group has. But to his point, we have to embrace what they are going to do because they're going to be in charge, to be honest with you. The knowledge and what you need to know about what this generation thinks, believes, and is motivated by, you'd better get quickly in front of that because they have the ability, through speed and efficiency, to make significant changes in society. To her point, she's right. They tend to work together. This is an interesting phenomenon. If I had to move a refrigerator from my house, I wouldn't go to my neighbor and say, can you help me? I'd go online and I'd just say, I need to remove a refrigerator from my house. 5 people would show up. So they can create groups very quickly and they can communicate instantly and solve problems in that fashion. So imagine, just translate that to, I think there's a problem with the military, as he brought it up, I don't think they're fully equipped. Before you know it, that information gets out not through the official press, to your point. They'll self-censor, they'll try and do what they can to keep things calm and in order. But what they can't control is that entire civilization around that entire group around them. It goes, that's not true. And you guys are holding back. We're not going to hold back. So this ability to try and control the message becomes more and more complicated, is my point. And journalists have to adapt. Many of them will say, well, I'm not going to censor anymore. I'm going to tell the story like it is. Our military needs help. We've got issues in all kinds of areas that I'm going to identify, et cetera. If they do that properly with the right factual reporting, et cetera, they'll be, what? Respected by the people who need to hear it. And by the way, they probably already agree with them already. They probably know that already. They probably have a son or a daughter or a nephew who's in the military who's been telling them that for probably years. That's the other part. We forget that groups, to her point, like the military, have families. They communicate, text, they communicate with everybody else. You don't think they could share it around the entire society in a heartbeat? So if a journalist says, well, I'm not going to report on that, you don't have to. It's already out there. What? When I go to look for it, there it is. And when I find out it's from actual people, actors inside that organization, now I look kind of silly trying to backpedal and say it's great, it's all good. So the curse of this is information can flow very quickly. The blessing is if you can understand where it comes from, its motivations, why is it happening, what do they try to accomplish, then you can be empowered with information to make the right decisions for you as an individual. But just know we are in this generational shift that is probably the biggest shift in society next to technology that we've ever seen. And that those who are trying to hold on to power Soviet-wise, the Soviet system, are realizing it's just quickly slipping away because they don't need it anymore. They found ways to accomplish what they need to do amongst themselves independently without the state. I see it again and again. We have research that supports it over and over. It's not unique to democracies. It's not unique to the Western world. It's everywhere. Last example, Saudi Arabia. Are women driving? Yeah, for the first time. Why? If I could show you the campaign that started online and on social media, it overwhelmed the state that said, we're not going to do this. We're going to hold fast. Not so fast. They had to crumble quickly because society rose up and said, this is wrong. And then add to that all that international pressure, and it's just one small example, lo and behold, states that felt they had a grip on everything lost it pretty quickly.
Thank you, James. We have about 5 more minutes, so I'm going to ask a question. Let's get a quick to answer responses. A lot of this discourse on national security, capacity building, and interrelation between media, civil society, and hard power capabilities are evolving around one important concept. The understanding that Armenia has a neighbor that seeks to basically shape terms through coercive force. And the one theme that is consistent, it's no longer latent, but very overt in Armenian society, is the threat of when is the next war going to be. Okay, so within that context, let's do the political science response to that, and then the role of the media or journalism in response to that. Anna, in your opinion, understanding developments, okay, as they're proceeding, we talked about liberal peace, illiberal peace, international political influence or pressure, etc., etc. As things develop, and assuming that the capacity for conflict increases, does the regional context make it more conducive to an inevitable conflict, or this geopolitical pluralism creates some safeguards from leading to war?
That's a really great question, and I think there's some answers in your question, and I agree with that assessment. So I think a lot what Baku decides on. First off, I do think Aliyev would like a conflict, and it has been trying to build a territorial international conflict with Armenia, which is different in its structure from the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. He cannot easily build a territorial conflict because it will be an interstate conflict, and he would not have the sort of the absolute sovereignty rhetoric and the law on his side. But he has been trying. So having said that, though, a lot what Baku calculates does depend on what transpires between Russia and Ukraine, perhaps in a battlefield, as well as in countries like Moldova, Central Asia, China. So it's a very, not just in South Caucasus, it's a complex place, but the Eurasian continent, which I'm fascinated by, and there is a marketplace between these great powers who are trying to vying for loyalty of these smaller states. Hence, Aliyev has been able to get away with some of the, whether it's the ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh or current attacks in the border. I just published an article. It came out just a few hours ago in the National Interest, specifically on it's not specifically on Azerbaijan, but it is on the peace process. So what has the peace process achieved and hasn't achieved? On the one hand, I do think that Azerbaijan has, but I'm really, really hoping, by the way, that I'm wrong. And political scientists are not very good at predicting. But at the same time, though, watching the peace process has been fascinating. While the peace process has not resulted in peace agreement, whatever content shape it has been, right, for the past how many years, right? But at the same time, the peace process has been, number one, it has been constraining Azerbaijan, but also it has been deepening the norms, liberal norms against conquest, against aggression, right? And it's I was just talking to folks before this, that it's very hard in Armenia when you say security, people think military. When you say security, people think deterrence. But as a small state, I don't think there's enough understanding and appreciation of the strategic value of norms, which is bread and butter for small states. So one of the things that this peace process has been accomplishing is the deepening of the norms against conquest. And in this, Georgia is a stakeholder, Azerbaijan is a stakeholder. Right now, it seems to have an upper hand, but it is a proxy state doing the bidding of, essentially it's lost big chunk of its sovereignty because it is doing the bidding for Turkey or for Russia. So all of the countries in the South Caucasus are, especially Georgia, are stakeholders of the deepening of the rules against conquest. And for the when we say, oh, the international rules-based world order is declining, we're doomed, it's not so simple. It's just South Caucasus is newly emerging into the world community, and the deepening of those norms is just happening. Moreover, while the United States, big liberal powers play an important role in safeguarding these norms, sometimes better, sometimes not so good, but these norms actually have emerged. They're long, they're very strong, they're under stress, but they're norms against conquest, state-to-state wars. State-to-state wars have declined dramatically since throughout the 20th century, which is why Russia's invasion in Ukraine is so anachronistic. It stands out. But these norms against conquest have been actually created by Latin American countries, end of the 19th century, because they felt the same insecurities from the bigger neighbors. The same way, perhaps not the same way, but similar. So now, Armenia's agency as a small state is very much in using this peace process to deepen these norms against conquest. So that's number one. Number two, in border delimitation, peace process, and peace agreement, for me, the way I'm thinking about this, these are different things. I think Aliyev will continue to use the border delimitation process as a way to constantly stress the Armenian domestic politics. And this way, we can derail Armenia's path to democratic consolidation. But this gives Armenian people an agency, that you do not have to react. Every time there's something in the Twitter, it does get your heart pumping, but you need to understand the context as to why it is put there, which is very difficult, right? It's easier said than done. So border delimitation overall, is a net positive for small states. I know it sounds, and have not been in the border. At the micro level, I have not spoken to the communities that are affected. I do not know which villages there are great analysis that is coming out, and I'm trying to understand it myself. But when you zoom out, border delimitation strengthens the states, small states. Right. Border delimitation also necessitates strengthening the border governance. So not only Armenia should really shoot for, before the COP29, try to get as much of the border delimited as possible. Because Azerbaijan, I think Baku does want a peace agreement. I do think Aliyev very much is looking for ways of whitewashing its image, especially after the ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh. So I don't know what they will do. I listened to Aliyev a little bit. Well, I sat through about 2 hours of a quote-unquote press conference, or me, or whatever it was. It looked like he's looking for ways to look for new ways of legitimizing his power post-COP29, right? So that does show internal weakness for the regime. It's just not sustainable. Oil is the oil, just
dropping.
Gas is not. So it's a very serious issues that Azerbaijan is facing. So in this context, I would say border delimitation is much more important for Armenia. While I do want Armenia to continue with the peace process and sign a peace agreement, I would not pin hopes that the peace agreement is going to bring peace. Peace, I've looked at this there's really exciting scholarship on this. Right now, Armenia's challenge is to manage the rivalry with Azerbaijan, move it from severe rivalry to negative, to less rivalry to negative peace, meaning you coexist, but you do not treat each other, you do not consider the violence, aggression on the table. Right now, it's on the table. And what I try to argue in the national interest article is precisely that before even as you continue working towards peace, it's important to get Azerbaijan commit to non-aggression. Before getting to yes, you need to essentially firmly say no to norms against violence, and there's precedent on it, which I talk about in the article.
Okay.
So.
I will make one quick point. The discussion on guarantees needs to be a little nuanced. You can request the involvement of third-party actors for specific processes and them serving as some form of actors, guarantors. But generally speaking, seeking a guarantor for any specific issue of state security simply doesn't work because it creates one dependency. And second, whoever it is that you're asking to be the guarantor, whether it's from the West or the East, it's very cost burdensome for them. And the incentive there isn't always consistent with your expectations. So the guarantee logic, or which has led to our savior complex logic, doesn't always produce security because it diminishes the exercise of agency and self-sufficiency, because instead of solving your problems, you always rely on the guarantor, and that can have a detrimental effect. But on specific issues such as delimitation, it can be a positive influence, but that is more context specific than anything else. I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you everybody for coming to our panel. Excellent.